Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And I'm sure you're wondering, why is an old army guy wearing a Go Navy shirt? Well, it's because I lost a bet. See, my best friend is an old submariner, and he and I have a standing bet every year on the Army-Navy game. Whoever loses the game wears the other team's t-shirt in public and posts a photo on social media. The last 2 years, he's had to wear a beaten Navy t-shirt. And this year, it's my turn. YouTube counts as social media, right? Yeah, imagine this will cover the bet. With a little luck, next year the universe will get back to the way it's supposed to be. And I'll be wearing a beaten Navy shirt, like this one. Which is the shirt he would have been wearing if the game had gone the right way. Anyway, let's get back to the Bronze Age, shall we? Today we're going to meet one of the greatest empires of the ancient world for the first time in our main timeline. We met the Assyrians already in our accelerated timeline when we talked about Tiglath-Pileser III and his victory at the Siege of Arpad in 740 BCE. Now, TP3 and Arpad are still 500 years in the future from today's battle, but the military traditions and some of the social engineering techniques that worked so well for TP3 got their start with today's king and today's battle, Adad-Nirari I and his victory over the Kassites at Kar Istar in 1280 BCE. So we think of the Assyrians as an Iron Age empire, but they've actually been with us for several episodes now. The culture grew out of the city of Ashur on the Tigris River around 1900 BCE, which means this is one of the few Bronze Age kingdoms that's still going to be around in the Iron Age. We haven't talked about them yet because they haven't been that important yet. The Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Babylonians have so far taken up all our attention in the late Bronze Age. But every great empire starts somewhere. And the kingdom that's going to become the Assyrian Empire is going to start for us today. So the city of Ashur was just another Mesopotamian city-state when it named its first king, Tudea, in 1900 BCE. Around the same time, merchants from Ashur somehow found their way up to a port city in Anatolia called Karam-Kanish. Merchant families from the two cities built partnerships with each other. And these partnerships made both cities hugely wealthy. But for some reason, the early Assyrian inscriptions refer to the Assyrian kings as kings who live in tents, which makes it look like the city's elites identified more with the shepherds who fed them, or with some nomadic tribe than with the merchants who were making their city rich. Which makes a little bit of sense in the context of Mesopotamia at the time. We've met at least one other culture of desert nomads who built a city, then an empire. The Amorites, who came out of the desert to build Babylon, are the ones who gave us Hammurabi back in the early 1700s BCE. The Kassites, who took over in Babylon after the Hittites sacked the city in 1595 BCE, came into the city out of the nearby mountains. So it's not hard to imagine that another pastoral culture might have taken over or built Ashur. And the kings who live in tents thing? That makes it sound like they tried to keep those traditions alive. Several nearby kingdoms kept Ashur and the Assyrians from getting too big for a while. The Hurrians, the Hatti, and the Amorites of Babylon all pushed in from different directions. But the Hittites put their boot on the Hurrians and the Hatti, and the Assyrian king Shamshi-Adad I kicked the Amorites out around 1800 BCE. Of course, Hammurabi took Ashur right back when he built his empire, but that empire didn't last long after his death in 1750 BCE. So the Assyrians enjoyed a couple of centuries of independence until around 1400 BCE when the Mitanni took over. Then the Hittites took over from the Mitanni. So Assyria experienced the same kind of back and forth empire juggling everybody else went through in the Bronze Age. Until the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit I kicked the Hittites out of his little kingdom sometime after 1350 BCE. And for a little while, The Assyrians were content with their independence. And then Adad-Nirari I came to power in 1307 BCE. And suddenly, independence was the old hot thing. The new hot thing was conquest. Adad-Nirari is the first Assyrian king we really know anything about, because he's the first one who kept good records. And that may have been less about an altruistic desire to preserve a record of his rule for posterity, and more about making sure everybody knew what a badass he was. Because Adad-Nirari seems to have had a pretty high opinion of himself, and it looks like it was well deserved, and he didn't get any respect from his fellow kings. More on that here in a little bit. So Adad-Nirari was not only a military genius, he also started a practice that ended up being critical to the Assyrians eventually taking over the entire Fertile Crescent: the forced resettlement of conquered peoples from one part of the empire to another. But this resettlement wasn't anything like the Trail of Tears or the Bataan Death March. No, the Assyrians moved people with critical skills to parts of the empire that needed them. So a mason might be moved to a city under construction, or a smith or a leather worker to an army town that needed them. If they had families, they moved together. If they needed vehicles or animals to help them make the move, or to move their tools, they got them. Because the important thing was to make sure they could turn their talents to supporting the empire instead of working against it. And there were plenty of places in Adad-Nirari's growing empire that needed skilled craftsmen. Because when he took a city, he did all the normal expected things, all the burning and looting and sacking, and then he rebuilt the city, usually bigger and better. So masons and brickmakers and framers, or whatever their Bronze Age equivalents were, had plenty of work. And after Adad-Nirari had cut his teeth on a few cities to his north and west, he turned his attention to the south. Because while the Hittites were occupied with their restless client state Mitanni, the Kassites of Babylon were talking shit to the south of Assyria. It's not clear where the Kassites came from originally, but in the 16th century BCE, they lived in the narrowest part of the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It looks like they were a minor culture in the region until the Hittites under King Mursili I came down the Euphrates Valley and sacked Babylon in 1595 BCE. See, Mursili didn't care at all about occupying Babylon. He seems to have only sacked the city to show he could. I made up a war story about it a few weeks ago in our episode on the sack of Babylon. So, Mursili sacked Babylon, then the wealthiest, most populous city in the world, and then he went home, where he was promptly assassinated by his brother-in-law. So the Hittites didn't bother with Babylon again. But the sack had basically put an end to the rule of the Amorites, the people who gave us Hammurabi 200 years earlier, and who had ruled the city since they built it around 1900 BCE. That left what we call a power vacuum in central Mesopotamia. So what's a power vacuum? You've heard the term before, I bet, but you may not have had anybody actually explain it to you since your 5th grade social studies class. Well, a power vacuum is what happens when the rulers of a particular area are removed over a short period of time. It could be a single king or an emperor or a president or whatever, taken out by a war or an assassination. It could be an entire ruling family taken out by a plague or other disaster. Or it could be an entire ruling class taken out by an invasion from without or a revolution from within. Now, a lot of the time those rulers got taken out for a good reason. They weren't performing the functions their people needed from them. Things like law enforcement, developing and repairing infrastructure, trade with people from other places, and defending the place from outside threats are all functions of government, or an oligarchy with deep pockets, or a really big church. But it's not enough just to remove shitty leaders. Once they're gone, you have to replace them with leaders who will do the things their people can't do for themselves. And until that happens, you have a power vacuum, which tends to attract all kinds of would-be leaders until somebody can rise to the top of the pile and assume control. Which is where the Kassites come in. With the Amorites out of the picture, the people of Babylon still needed somebody to perform the functions of a government. In what was still an enormously wealthy city with a population of tens of thousands, ideally situated to take advantage of trade on both rivers. Hell, it's such a peach of a gig it makes you wonder whether the Kassites had something to do with Mursili's decision to sack the city. But whether they did or not, the Amorites were gone, and the Kassites stepped into the gap just as quick as they could. They don't seem to have ever tried to expand their empire outside southern Mesopotamia. They took over or built several other cities in the plain between the rivers, mostly in the region that was already under Babylon's influence, and extended their control all the way down to Ur in southern Mesopotamia. They focused most of their attention to the south and east, conquering Elam and sacking its capital Susa sometime in the late 1300s BCE. And around the same time, they built a new capital called Dur-Kurigalzu, north of Babylon in a little town we call Baghdad today. And by 1280 BCE, the Kassites were at the height of their power. Under King Nazi-Marutus, they had begun nipping at the Assyrians, mostly by means of small-scale attacks by a hill tribe allied with the Kassites called the Gutians. Nazi-Marutus seems to have been trying to annoy the Assyrians with bug bites rather than smashing them with a decisive victory, which may say something about how the Kassites preferred to fight their wars, or about the relative military strength of the two kingdoms. But whatever it says about the Kassites, it was more than an annoyance to Adad-Nirari's father, King Arik-den-Eli. In order to understand why, just think about the American experience in Vietnam and Afghanistan. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong in Vietnam and the Taliban in Afghanistan knew damn well they could never take us in a stand-up fight. Every time they tried, they got their asses handed to them. But even the U.S. military couldn't be everywhere at once, so they figured out how to hit softer targets, like small patrols and logistics convoys and unguarded villages. This hurt our ability to resupply our troops and support the local population, not to mention tearing the hell out of our troops' morale and making us less popular among the folks who lived there. And at the end of the day, we had to leave both countries wondering what the hell we were supposed to have accomplished. Well, those two wars had a pretty profound effect on the way we think about ourselves as a country, and they were both on the other side of the world. Now imagine if those folks had been able to hit trade caravans in California and Maryland and Alabama, and those caravans were the lifeblood of our country. Imagine how we would react if prices went up because somebody was hitting ships just off our shores and closing ports, and forcing imports to go far out of their way to get their stuff to our markets. Now imagine how we would respond if Mexico or Canada was behind the attacks, not hitting us directly, but financing and arming and feeding the guerrillas and the terrorists, and maybe passing intel to them so they would know what to hit and where and how. That might give you an idea of how bug bites can threaten the stability of an entire country. That's the kind of thing Nazi-Marutus was instigating against the Assyrians, the kind of thing Arik-den-Eli couldn't figure out how to stop. Then Adad-Nirari took the throne, and shit got real. No shit, there they were. The BS meter for this story is about an 8 out of 10. We have names and approximate dates, but I've had to make up most of the details. So before we get to the made up part, what do we know? Well, we know Adad-Nirari conquered Mitanni before he turned his attention toward Babylon, or maybe one of his predecessors did. Or maybe he completed the conquest one of his predecessors had started years ago by weakening Mitanni. But sometime between 1307 and 1280 BCE, Adad-Nirari attacked Mitanni, captured their king, forced him to swear loyalty to Assyria, and probably to Adad-Nirari personally, and put him back on the throne as a vassal. I can't decide whether he did that to honor the king of Mitanni or to humiliate him. Was he a worthy adversary, good enough to resume his old seat but under Adad-Nirari? Or was he a pathetic loser not worth killing? Well, Adad-Nirari seems to have really wanted the major regional kings, like the Hittites and the Egyptians, to accept him into their club as a great king, which I think was just a king who had other kings working for him. So he would probably have wanted to be generous to a conquered king, which makes it seem to me like he was trying to honor the Mitanni king. That, and he seems to have understood that the best way to keep control of his captured territories was to make sure to give them rulers they were comfortable with. and you wouldn't want to humiliate somebody you wanted your people to accept as a ruler. But whatever he wanted to accomplish by his little stunt worked with the Mitanni, but not with the Hittites. He wrote a letter to the Hittite king Mursili III addressing him as brother, which was a common way for great kings to greet each other. And Mursili wrote him back saying basically, "Who the hell you calling brother, little king dude?" So whatever his accomplishments, Adad-Nirari was not part of the club yet, which is understandable, at least on the part of the Hittites. After all, Mitanni was right on their southern border, which meant the Assyrians were now on their southern border and potentially a threat. So until he knew what Adad-Nirari wanted, Mursili wouldn't have wanted to encourage him. And the Hittites clearly considered the Assyrians a potential threat, even if they didn't treat Adad-Nirari like a serious conqueror. Otherwise, with a threat so close to their border, you have to think they would have attacked and kicked them out of Mitanni. The fact that they didn't suggests to me that Mursili wasn't sure he'd come out on top in that fight. And the fact that Adad-Nirari didn't press north toward Hattusa suggests he wasn't sure about it either. At any rate, there was no need yet. So Adad-Nirari had Mitanni under his boot heel, and the Hittites weren't doing anything about it but talking shit. Seems like the Assyrians didn't have anything to worry about to the north and the west. So it was time to shift focus downriver to the south. It was time for Nazi-Marutus to get a boot in his ass. Now, pretty much all we have about this battle is a couple of lines in Adad-Nirari's records that say he and Nazi-Marutus fought at Kar Istar, and Adad-Nirari brought about his total defeat and took his camp and his standards away from him. Then he shifted the border down closer to Dur-Kurigalzu. So that's what we had to work with. How do we get there? Well, Adad-Nirari was one of the first Assyrian kings to implement a policy of annual campaigns. So he would return to Ashur when the campaign season was over, probably in the fall and winter when the rivers flood and the rains make traveling difficult. He would use the off-season to train new troops and repair his equipment, as well as laying up supplies and transportation for the next year's campaigns. Oh yeah, and decide who he was going to conquer next year. Then, when the rain stopped in the late spring, he would lead his army out again. And in 1280 BCE, he led him south toward Babylon. Nazi-Marutus' first response to the Assyrian invasion was to laugh. He saw no reason to take Adad-Nirari any more seriously than Mursili did. Yeah, he'd gotten lucky with Mitanni, but he obviously couldn't have gone north against the Hittites, which meant he could never make it through the Babylonian cities and troops between him and Dur-Kurigalzu. He'd probably march south for a few days, maybe find a Babylonian city to lay siege to, then Nazi-Marutus would march north to meet him. He'd probably be satisfied with a small tribute payment. It was always so easy to bribe the smaller kings to go away, and things would get back to normal. Hell, whatever he had to pay Adad-Nirari, it'd probably be less than his Gudian allies had brought him from the Assyrian trade convoys. So Nazi-Marutus took his time getting his troops together. And then his messengers brought some unexpected news. Adad-Nirari wasn't laying siege to cities or fishing for a payout. He was marching down the Tigris, burning towns and sacking cities. Well, okay. If that was how the Assyrians wanted to play, the Babylonians would oblige. They'd have to work just a little bit harder than they would to pay the Assyrians off, but maybe this way they wouldn't come back next year. Hell, if he was lucky, he could capture or kill Adad-Nirari himself, maybe even be able to take a hand in choosing his successor. That'd keep him out of his hair for a good long time. Well, you already know that's not how this is going to go. So let's see what Adad-Nirari does when he goes up against the famous Babylonian army. As far as I could find out, we don't know where Kar Istar was, or the province of Uarsulu where the city sat. So I'm arbitrarily saying it's on the Tigris, about a third of the way from Ashur to Dur-Kurigalzu. More or less where the border was at the height of Assyria's power in the Bronze Age. A few hundred years later, the Assyrian Empire would contain Babylon and Ur and every city in between. But for now, this is where we are. Which means Nazi-Marutus had to move his army a lot farther than Adad-Nirari had to move his. And now that the Assyrians were sacking his cities, he needed to move with a sense of urgency. So he pushed his troops hard, And they did the 100 miles from the capital to Kar Istar in 6 days. In fact, they marched so fast they outran the ox-drawn wagons carrying their supplies. So when the Kassites got to Kar Istar, they were exhausted and hungry. But they were healthy young men, Kassites of Babylon, and their spears were sharp, and they were ready to face whatever the Assyrians could throw at them. But Adad-Nirari had a huge head start, and he had only had to march about half the distance the Kassites had, and not nearly as fast. So by the time the Babylonians got there, the Assyrians had already been there for 2 days. And they had used that time. Adad-Nirari had set up his lines with the city about 5 miles in his rear, with his left flank anchored on the Tigris and his right on a canal about half a mile west of the river. But he only had about 6,000 infantry and 1,000 chariots in his main line. He left 1/3 of his infantry between his main line and Kar Istar to guard against the town garrison. But he had a couple of tricks up his sleeve. The plain in front of his infantry was littered with stones and beams and other random pieces of the homes and buildings he had demolished outside the city walls. The obstacles would keep the Babylonian chariots from charging his infantry lines and break up any infantry formations before they could get to him. And he had an ace up his sleeve: 1,000 archers forward of his lines in hidden positions on the west side of the canal, where at his signal they could pour arrows into the Babylonian left flank. The Babylonians arrived on the field as the sun was setting, and Adad-Nirari left them alone as they made camp and prepared to fight him on the next day. And even arriving tired and without their baggage, the army of Babylon was an impressive sight. At least 15,000 men who took the time to ring their camp with shields and chariot stakes before they set their watch and turned in for the night. Well, that sight made the Assyrian soldiers nervous, but Adad-Nirari had been king for more than 25 years by that time, and he took a couple hours to walk through the camp, reassuring his men, telling funny stories, reminding them they were Assyrians. And whatever happened in the morning, he told them he knew they would make him proud. And in the darkness before first light the next morning, he sprang his trap. Archers outside the city started loosing fire arrows over the city wall, shooting blindly in hopes that they could catch a few roofs on fire inside Kar Istar. And luck was with them, as it turned out. Before long, the glow of flames lit up the edge of the town farthest from the river, and the town watch, groggy in the pre-dawn darkness, responded slowly, and the fire spread. The Babylonians in their camp would be able to see the city burning a long time before the sun came up. And sure enough, the alarm went up in the camp. The Babylonian soldiers, still tired from their march and not quite awake yet from their short sleep, started to stir like an anthill after it's been kicked. And that's when Adad-Nirari sprang the second part of his trap. 200 of his archers had crossed the canal in the night, creeping close enough to the camp that now they could start peppering it with arrows. It wasn't enough to cause serious casualties, but it caused a few, and more importantly, it added to the confusion in the Babylonian camp and scared the hell out of the soldiers who had gone to bed thinking they would be safe until they formed up for battle the next day. And now they were under attack, in the dark, and still tired and hungry. But they were soldiers, and it didn't take them long to get themselves under control. And before the sun had cleared the horizon, an entire battalion was outside the camp pursuing the archers back to the canal. And the rest of the army was getting ready for battle. If the Assyrians wanted to fight at some ridiculous hour of the morning, the Kassites would oblige them. Well, Adad-Nirari formed up his lines as if he planned to wait for the Babylonians to attack, which was exactly what he should have done, outnumbered as he was. And then, without waiting for the Babylonians to get their formations fully set, he started his troops forward. Because his pre-dawn nuisance attacks had given him the initiative, and he had no intention of giving it up. Now, by the rules of war of the day, this was kind of a dick move. The way a civilized king fought was to wait until his adversary had a chance to form his lines and get ready for him. But Adad-Nirari was outnumbered at least 2-1, and the other great kings had already told him to go fuck himself. So why would they think he would play by their rules? So the Babylonians rushed to form their lines before the sun was fully up in the face of an Assyrian advance, with Assyrian archers still peppering the chariots on the Babylonian left with arrows. Horses were going down now, and drivers, and the confusion among the chariots gave Adad-Nirari the cover he needed to get his infantry through the obstacles they had set up. And they got through, and they straightened up their lines, and they headed straight for the Kassite infantry, still struggling to form a solid line. And the Assyrian chariots now charged their counterparts, sending a hail of arrows in front of them as they closed the distance. And that was enough for the Babylonian chariots to say, "Fight!" The chariots that could still move wheeled around and left, high-tailing it off the field, except for Nazi-Marutus and his bodyguard. The Babylonian infantry was more stubborn. They managed to get enough of a line set that they met the Assyrian infantry with a full shield wall, even if it was only a couple of guys deep in a few places. The Kassites, with their greater numbers, would be able to hold on to their advantage if they could keep their lines from breaking. So soldiers coming up from the camp threw themselves into the line wherever it was thinnest, fighting next to guys they didn't know just to hold the line. But the Assyrian chariots were now running free in their flank and rear, at least until the Babylonian chariots could rally and get back to the field. So while part of the chariot force surrounded the king and his bodyguard, the rest hit the Kassite left flank, and the archers came out from behind the canal and started pouring arrows into the Kassites from the flank and the rear. So how long does it take to kill 15,000 men with hand weapons? Well, they almost never let you find out. Eventually, if you attack an army from two sides and leave it a way to escape, it's going to run away. And the Kassites were no exception. They were stubborn and they were good fighters, but they weren't suicidal. And by mid-morning, they were streaming back toward their camp. But Adad-Nirari wasn't inclined to let them go. His men pursued him into their camp, killing anybody they could catch. They plundered the camp, taking anything of value they found, and then continued after the fleeing Kassites. And just a few miles past the camp, they ran into the Kassite supply train, the wagons still in the process of trying to turn around because they had just heard about the rout from the survivors who still hadn't been caught. So by the end of the day, the camp and the supply train and Nazi-Marutus were all in Assyrian hands. And Adad-Nirari was magnanimous to most of the survivors. He took their weapons and their chariots and their horses and their drivers. And he took the wagons and their oxen and their drivers, but he let everybody else go. And the Kassites left almost 4,000 guys dead at a cost of only 200 Assyrians. And he gave Nazi-Marutus a choice. He could go home if he agreed to pay a massive annual tribute to the Assyrians and never make war against them again. Or he could be a sacrifice to the Assyrian god of war. Nazi-Marutus chose option 2. So Adad-Nirari had him stripped naked, tied to a post, and he split his skull with his own sword. And he sent the dead king's body back to Dur-Kurigalzu with an invitation for the next king to come and make a treaty with him. And of course he sacked Kar Istar because he and his men had nothing better to do while they waited for the new king to come have a chat. Then he made a deal with Nazi-Marutus' successor, Kadisman-Turgu, that set the border between the two empires just south of Kar Istar. Looks like he still didn't get the recognition he wanted, which was admission to the Great Kings Club. But he seems to have made the best of it, calling himself King of the Universe and carrying on with his empire building. And a couple of years later, the new Hittite king, Mursili III's successor, Hattusili III, asked him to intervene to keep one of his border cities from attacking one of the Hittites' border cities. So maybe he made it into the club after all. Adad-Nirari ruled Assyria until about 1274 BCE, 31 years or so. By the time he died, Assyria was without question a major power in Mesopotamia, and its power would only grow in the next few centuries. But we'll get to that in future war stories. With a BS meter of 8 out of 10, we're not going to have a scoreboard this time. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. If you want to leave a comment or ask a question, I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me, especially that one you're thinking about right now. And for the record, beat Navy. Until next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.